Which chapter are we starting on?
We're going to start on chapter 6. I've got one more thing to do in
Okay.
chapter 6, and then we'll
And are we
move
going
on.
to like the religion one and
Yeah.
all that? Okay.
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out one thing about that I hadn't.
What is this chart? Since we didn't read chapter 10, I was going to ask
What
you.
page is that on?
144.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yes, this is
Is this like
all
a
the
breakdown?
branches of knowledge
Really?
that he put
Did
together.
he create it?
He put it together, yeah. So science and it is kind of interesting because back then, truly science and philosophy were not distinguished, you know. And so he tries to make these distinctions, natural philosophy or natural science on one side, and then political philosophy on the other, and it sort of stands by itself, and
That's
then
cool.
out of natural science you get all these other branches, but political science is a different type of beast, and then he just divides it into consequences
Yeah.
from the institution of commonwealth, and then duties and rights.
It's crazy how far he like breaks it down, like all the way to poetry and music and logic.
And it's an interesting, you know, I wouldn't have necessarily gotten ethics over there in that category of natural philosophy. I would have probably put it in the political philosophy.
That's what I was thinking too, but that surprised me you put that there, but it's interesting.
It is. Yeah, I think that might be the only chart that Hobbes ever made. I don't remember
Really?
seeing a lot
Yeah.
of charts, yeah.
Yeah, I was just flipping through and I saw it and I'm like, that's interesting.
Yeah, good question. Let's see, so, yeah, there was one thing I just wanted to point out on page 135, because it will be important pretty soon, and that is where he says in this one paragraph here, by this it is manifest that not only actions that have their beginning from covetousness, ambition, lust, or other appetites to the thing propounded, but also those that have their beginning from aversion or fear of those consequences that follow are voluntary actions. That's a lot, he writes in such a convoluted way, but he adds fear to the motivation for action that is voluntary. So in other words, even if you act out of fear, what you do is voluntary.
So yeah, it's fear to the motion of voluntary action?
Yes, exactly, right. Because most people of his day would have argued that if let's say that a robber comes along and says your money or your life, right? And you go, okay, I'll give you my wallet, please don't kill me. You know, most people would say, well, that wasn't truly a voluntary act because you were forced to because of your fear of for your life. Hobbes wants to say every action that you make is similarly voluntary. It comes from a particular passion, in this case fear, but you'd have a choice, right? You could decide, I'll risk my life, right? So this becomes important because he's going to base the social contract on fear,
Yep.
right? So if it's not voluntary, then you don't have that agreement, you don't have that buy-in. So that's why he says that.
Okay.
And then I wanted to point out one thing in chapter 11, which I didn't have people read, but it's an important passage that everybody has heard of. And that's on page 149, middle of the left-hand column, where he starts felicity. He says, felicity is a continual progress of the desire from one object to another, the attaining of the former being still but the way to the latter. The cause whereof is that the object of man's desire is not to enjoy only once and for one instance of time, but to assure forever the way of his future desire. Okay, so he thinks into the future. And therefore the voluntary actions and inclinations of all men tend not only to the procuring, but also to the assuring of a contented life, and differ only in the way, which ariseth partly from the diversity of passions and diverse men, and partly from differences of knowledge. So in other words, all people want not only safety and security and happiness now, but they want it in the future. The only difference is what they think will get them that. Okay, so they disagree very much about what may make them safe and what may make them contented. And so then he goes on and says, so that in the first place I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. So the one thing you can count of, and this also is important in the state of nature, is that desire for power. Because with power you can get whatever else you think you need. And the cause of this is not always that a man hopes for a more intensive delight than he already has attained, or that he cannot be content with a moderate power, but because he cannot assure the power and means to live well, which he has at present, without the acquisition of more. So here he accounts for the fact, the critic may say, but you know, there are some people who don't want very much, and there are some people who have moderate temperaments, and there are others who are very aggressive. And what he's going to argue is that in the state of nature, in that situation, pretty much it forces everybody to want that power, whether they're timid by nature or moderate by nature, because they want to survive and they don't know what other people are thinking. They have to reach out for as much power as they can get. So it equalizes people in many ways, and that's one of the ways it does. Okay, so that's his picture of human nature, that restless, continual desire for power.
Okay.
And you can never have enough power and control in the state of nature because you don't know what's going to happen next. Okay, that's sort of, it's kind of the way a lot of people think about money. You know, I've got enough to be happy right now, but I don't know what's going to happen to me in the future. Therefore, I have to keep working and I can't keep piling it up, out of security. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the religion chapter. We've already talked about religion a little bit, so we'll just cover a couple of things here. But first of all, it's interesting that he places that chapter on religion right before he starts talking about
It is.
Yeah, what did you think of the placement?
I don't know. Because it's like he talks about this and then brings up in the next chapter, actually the next few chapters. Are you talking kind of before the
state of nature and the social contract?
Yeah, because it's like he goes in depth to it, but then he like re-references it because he brings up religion in the state of nature. So it's kind of like him saying, like, I don't know how to phrase it, like.
Yeah, you're right though. That's he brings it up continually, not only there but all throughout the book. So this is kind of his attempt to explain religion in naturalistic terms, and it's a challenging way to do it. It's a challenging placement because he's saying this is very important and this is what I think, and this is one of those chapters that got him into trouble with traditional believers, because he starts out with the question, what are the natural causes of religion? And it's almost like he's looking at it like a psychologist.
That's what I thought too.
Yeah, right. What causes people to want to believe? And he says, well, first of all, we're curious about our own good and evil fortune, meaning, we're thinking, what's going to happen to me in the future? Is it good or bad? And second, we seek the cause of our fortune. We seek the causes of things. And third, we can't always find a cause. So therefore, our mind tries to think one up. And because we're so anxious about life and death, if we don't know the cause, we will create superhuman power, right? So the first type of religion that comes about is polytheism, he says, because people tend to break down, I don't understand the causes of these natural things, so there must be a spirit that makes the wind blow and, fire and then, the human things, what causes war, what causes, why did this bad thing happen to me? Well, it must be because I didn't pray correctly, or I didn't do my dance correctly, or whatever. So that's natural religion, and he's going to expound on that further in the third part of the book on the Christian
Are we
conquest.
reading that part?
Yeah, we'll read part of it, right. And I think he comes back to natural religion even in the second part too a little bit, because he starts to use it, though, in the Christian Commonwealth to justify why it is that people ought to be willing to basically obey the sovereign no matter what he tells you to do with religion. Because he says all religion fulfills these natural purposes. It may be, there's different types of Protestantism. He doesn't say Catholicism, but his logic applies. Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, whatever, if the sovereign tells you to worship this way, you're still okay with God because you're showing these natural signs of respect.
Okay.
So he's got a plan for everything. He's dropping the reasoning here. The other thing I wanted to point out was he talks about the religious diversity that does exist out of this.
Okay. Yeah, I remember him talking about that.
Yep, and it's religious diversity that causes conflict, but it doesn't need to. So on the bottom right of 153, he says, and in these four things, opinion of ghosts, ignorance of second causes, devotion towards what men fear, and taking of things casual for prognostics, meaning taking that flight of birds that's going overhead and say, oh, that's a sign, that's an omen, right? These constitute the natural seed of religion, by which reason of the different fancies, judgments, and passions of several men hath grown up into ceremonies so different that those which are used by one man are for the most part ridiculous to another.
I underline that.
Yeah. That's, sounds fairly relativistic, right? Many people take these differences very seriously.
Well, it's like crazy how much this kind of applies to today with all the different branches of Christianity that constantly try and fight each other for having the most members, and all that. So it's
now we
it's
fight
crazy.
over members for the most part. Although in Ireland, there's still the Catholics and the Protestants are still fighting. But and they will see those differences as very, very important. Whether there's a liturgy, whether you believe in transubstantiation or consubstantiation or symbolic, Last Supper, those are huge differences to the people within these different groups. But from Hobbes's perspective, they're just all different branches off of the same natural reactions, right? And if you want to read further into his commentary, you could certainly conclude that Hobbes doesn't think that any of those approaches is necessarily best or true because of their origins, right? They're all expressions of these very primitive fears and desires.
So isn't he kind of saying that, all of these branches, they need to basically settle their differences and try and convene together so we don't have all of this conflict? Or just, I guess, unite under the sovereign, right?
Right.
And just not branch out so we don't have all of these conflicting views.
Right, What you first said sounded closer to Locke. Locke basically says, you guys need to realize that these differences are superficial and that what you agree on is much more important.
But Hobbes is more of the sovereign, what you take the sovereign's view,
right?
So you don't have all of those branching.
And part of the reasoning is the same because these differences aren't nearly as important as you think they are. You should be willing to accept the sovereign's preferences and just realize that you're still worshiping God.
Okay.
But he seems to think that we can't continue to see all of this diversity around us without getting riled up and fighting. So you can see how the transition to toleration wasn't hard, because this reasoning leads to toleration, basically. If you can get people to really believe that the differences are not that important, they will be able to tolerate. But I guess Hobbes didn't think he could get most people to believe that. Yeah. But then why did he argue it? That's the curious thing for me.
I would have a lot of questions to ask him if you were still living.
Me too. Why did you throw that in there? Because it angered people who followed him and really understood the conclusions, and it didn't persuade anybody of the need to discount their beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it just made people angry. So it didn't work, but yeah, I would ask him that question too. So he lumps in polytheism.
Mm-hmm.
He lists a whole lot of different ways that people try to control nature in their lives with horoscopes and witchcraft and all these different things. And then the other thing I wanted to point out was he gives Christianity one paragraph in the midst of all this on the left side of 156.
Okay.
He just sort of drops that paragraph in there and deals
Is it
with
the middle paragraph?
Yeah,
Yep.
this middle
Mhm.
paragraph.
Yeah.
He deals with Judeo-Christianity as if it were real. And then he goes right back into his, God himself by supernatural revelation planted religion. Where he did that, there he also made to himself a peculiar kingdom. So the tone changes there.
Mhm.
And he's at least paying lip service to the fact that people are believers, the people who are reading his work. Now, people can speculate, why did he throw that in there? Okay. Well, he may believe that there's a difference. He may want to make sure his readers don't get too angry with what he said above, that they can distinguish now between the true religion and all of these other false religions.
So people kind of think he threw it in there just to kind of peel
Yeah,
his readers on
to
it. Yeah.
throw the readers off a bit, to cover his tracks, to make sure that they did not get turned off, although they did.
Mhm.
So yeah, there's speculation about why he does this type of thing. But notice that he just goes right back into a discussion of more generally of the attributes of religion. So anyway, I wanted to point that out. Any questions that you have about?
There was one about, I can't remember where it is. Oh, I just highlighted this because he talks about the schoolmen again. That was funny.
Okay, yeah.
In 157.
Mm-hmm. He uses that term, and also the divines.
This I had a question about at the end of 157. He says, so that I may attribute all the changes of religion in the world to one and the same cause, and that is unpleasing priests, and those not only amongst Catholics, but even the church that hath presumed most of Reformation. So is he trying to trick them that he's like talking bad about Catholicism the whole time, but in reality he's talking bad about all Christianity, all faith?
Yeah, and that's kind of a rare example where he actually kind of comes out and says, in a fairly low-key way, that he also is applying these comments to Protestants.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, he does.
It seems like he's like trying his best not to come out and directly say that he's targeting them so they don't get too upset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that wouldn't serve his purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever he goes off lots of times on Catholics and uses Catholic terminology when he's criticizing religion. So that's definitely a strategy for him.
Gotcha.
And a very successful one.
Mm-hmm.
Even Locke does that to a certain extent. Anti-Catholicism ran really deep.
It did. Mm-hmm.
So
A
now
lot of people just, I think, had a lot of opposition to the Pope at the time and all that.
Here he could be, there's a little bit of wiggle room here because the Church of England, the official church, was officially neither Catholic or Protestant. It was born out of, Henry VIII basically establishing a church. He was the head of the church. But Reformation ideology was all over the Anglican Church. So it's a technical little bit of wiggle room that he might have thought of when he wrote that. But certainly he's coming a bit close there to telling the truth.
Mm-hmm. It seems, and then he just ends it right before he wants to fully come out and say anything too drastic.
Yeah, that was a good catch.
Yeah. I read that one like, oh, that's interesting.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the state of nature. So he calls this the natural condition of
You start
mankind.
on 13? Is
Yep,
that where it
chapter
starts? Okay.
13. And what is the natural condition of mankind like? What do you remember about it?
I read this chapter last week. Talks a lot about equality,
Mm-hmm.
like a lot about it.
Yep.
I remember,
Yep. People are equal.
he says that basically, I can't remember where he says it. There's one thing that, yeah, kind of at the end of 158, like right around here,
Mhm.
he proves that men are equal, like through
Mhm.
mind and through body, practically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, both in
Mhm.
because in this situation, it doesn't really matter if you threw a scholar into the state of nature, it wouldn't be his scholarly skills that would matter.
Mhm.
And also he argues that physical differences don't matter a
Mhm.
great deal because human beings can plot and scheme and they can wait and, So logically speaking, this reasoning applies to women and men. It applies to anybody old enough to be able to think long enough to defend themselves or to plot an attack. So it's truly equalizing in that way. And people are equal
Were people
because...
pretty opposed to this at the time? I bet.
Yeah, this notion of utter equality was not something that went down too well either,
Mhm.
because this was the time when certainly the aristocratic
Mhm.
class thought there was a difference. Men and women definitely thought there was a difference between the two of them as well, and he doesn't go anywhere much with the gender thing, but I've read just about everything Hobbes wrote, and there are spots where he actually deals with women and children
Mhm.
in the state of nature as having equal rights, right? The right to self-preservation and
Mhm.
being able to be somewhat of a threat. That the implication of that could be that women's equality in the civil society is artificial.
Mhm.
He doesn't argue that we ought to do away with it because that's not his purpose, but just the very fact that it was there.
Mhm. Yeah.
They would have believed in racial inequality, class inequality, gender inequality, and here comes Hobbes saying
Everybody's equal.
everybody's equal, everybody has reason, everybody has the
I
need
find
to
it
survive.
really interesting. He says like everybody's equal on a mental level too.
Mhm.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because you don't, like I said, you don't need to have an excessive amount of knowledge to operate in this world, and what knowledge you do need is very different.
Mhm.
So whether you're, in one instance of the state of nature is a civil war. In fact, that's what he had in mind, really, a breakdown of governmental order. And you would have people in chaotic situations with higher educations, priests, down to people who were illiterate.
Mhm.
But what mattered was their cleverness, their ability to think a few steps ahead, their ability to do violence.
Mhm.
And so it's a great equalizer. So that implies, and whatever gets us out of it is going to have to include all the people who are equal in the state of nature.
I had another question real quick. Doesn't he kind of say that everybody's equal because, we can kill each other whenever too?
Yep. I mean,
Yeah.
well, that's ultimately
Yeah.
the reason, right? We have women, children, men of various sizes, but he says even the weakest can kill the
Can kill the
strongest.
strongest.
Because there's always a time when the strongest is vulnerable. They have to sleep,
Mhm.
they're indisposed, or they're not looking, and
Mhm.
the other can swoop down on them. So yeah, and that's a very basic and kind of cynical source of equality. I can kill you, therefore we're equal, right?
Mhm.
But it's very persuasive. It's what he's looking for is something that everybody can agree upon. Remember his geometric method of reasoning. And he wants to go to where he will not get any dissent. And he's thinking, well, what could be more clear than this? That truly, if we think about it, we may not like it, but who's going to deny? That even a child can kill an adult under certain circumstances. All right, so equal in body and mind, we've already talked about that. So not only equal in the ability to plot, but also in finding confederacies. And he does say that people will make temporary confederacies, but they're very temporary and they cannot. I think in De Cive he talks about what I would call gangs. Gangs may develop, parties may develop, but there's no trust amongst them either, and they'll break up quickly. So, we've already talked about women's inequality as well. It comes from the social compact in this reasoning. Interestingly, Locke does make a deal over this. Hobbes really, it's just sort of...
So Locke does kind of get into it more.
Yeah, for Hobbes it's sort of intellectual tidiness. But for Locke it's more than that. He actually talks about marriage being an artificial compact.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he does talk, he actually
I'm
says...
excited to read Locke. I've never read Locke before, so...
Well, you'll be able to see how he takes some things from Hobbes and leaves him behind with other things.
Is he more of a realist thinker, too?
No, he's just as much a realist thinker. Yeah, he just goes off in a different direction, but they're both realists.
Okay.
Locke sees human nature in a very realistic way as well.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, with women, he actually comes right out and says, women's inequality is a choice based upon compact. Now, that may not be too plausible because that means that all women agreed, to enter into a social contract in which they were not equal to men. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense at that level, but nevertheless, this is a really new and strange idea, I think, to a lot of people back then. Okay, so our equality in nature, he says, leads us to equal hope of attaining our ends. Okay, so that means, the things we need to survive, first and foremost, and as much security as we can get. So literally, we want to be able to grab the fruits of the earth, to be able to have not only enough for today, but tomorrow. And because of this, we will run into competition over scarce resources, whether the water hole, or whatever, or something that isn't everywhere that you need. So this is going to cause people to come into contact with each other.
Very, very true.
And then, because we cannot know what is in the other's mind, we have to assume that other is supremely dangerous to us. So even if you are a very peace-loving person who would rather be left alone, even if you are one of those people, logically, you'll still need to try to kill that other person because that other person could kill you. So you're always going to be on alert, you're always going to be ready, and you're going to default to self-defense whenever you see another person. So he says this is a state of continual warfare, okay? And on top of the fear which causes you to preemptively harm others, and this is where, again, it's an interesting little, I don't know, some people say it's kind of a glitch in Hobbes' reasoning, but he says you also have this desire to have others hold you in awe and, look up to you as better than them. That's a social quality, and people say, well, Hobbes described the state of nature as sort of a pre-social state. Nobody cares about anybody else. Everybody's antisocial. But yet, so why would people get any pleasure out of basically having other people fear them or look up to them? Why would they get that sort of social pressure, pleasure out of it? Well, he's really thinking again of the Civil War situation where you really do have socialized people who have descended into chaos. And so they come with that social baggage, and they desire, they both fear, but they also desire, that admiration and glory, right? That's the only way to explain it. But there's a little maybe logical inconsistency there, right? Because I can see in that pure state of nature being afraid and even killing over insecurity, but to get pleasure out of dominating others is a social thing.
Okay.
But he adds it in here, and it makes that warfare even more vicious, because now it doesn't even matter if you feel threatened. You're going to want to try to be the number one, right?
Okay.
All right, so he says, so these are the three principal causes of war: competition, diffidence, which is old-fashioned for fear, and glory or pride. And of course, we know that in the actual Civil War that did occur in his lifetime, he thought pride was the worst factor.
He did?
It was pride, the pride of preachers and ideologues who got people fighting with each other so that they could be on top, so that they could be powerful. He says this is what motivated them. And they forgot about fear until obviously when it comes knocking on your door, but yeah.
Gotcha.
Okay. So, without government, there's this constant state of war, and by war he means not only when you're actually fighting, but also in your constant vigilance. And he describes a situation where people can never be at rest, and because they can never be at rest, they can't be at all secure. How could you even build yourself a home? Because somebody else is going to come along and tear that down, and they're going to kill you for it. So literally you're reduced to hunting and gathering type of a way of life, basically sleeping under a tree, because there's no way you can, and you can't accumulate, and because you can't even hide it, I mean, there's somebody's going to take it. So it's a very, very day-to-day existence, and there can be absolutely no civilization. He would have been maybe a little bit surprised to see Native Americans, for instance, or Native peoples who had very loose government, not the type of government that he thought would bring peace, but were able to live in relative security. They had to, guard against other tribes, but Locke does a better job of dealing with the state of nature. And he does talk about Native Americans. And he says, Locke says, well, they live insecurely, but they don't live in a complete state of war like Hobbes said they would. They have the hope of being able to defend themselves against attackers. But this is what Hobbes says, and again, this is very much what he's trying to say this to the people of his day who plunged into civil war. On the left-hand side of 159, second full paragraph, he says, whatsoever, therefore, is consequent to a time of war where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security. Then what with their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no cultivation of the earth, no navigation, no use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving or removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
I find it interesting that he says out of everything, the continual fear is the worst. It's the worst thing to have. And I also find it funny how he tries to make this like as dramatic and harsh sounding as possible to show the importance
Mm-hmm.
of having that common power.
Yeah, he's saying, look, people, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
This is what you lose. You think that you can have.
This got the eyes of people.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine it would.
Yes, this did, and it still does. This is probably, if people know anything about what Hobbes says, it's this last
I'm going to say
sentence.
this is pretty popular, isn't
Mhm.
it, this part? That's what I thought. Because I've read it and I'm like, I've heard this before.
You actually
Yeah.
hear people quote it in political speeches, and I heard it the other day on TV.
Did you
I
really?
can't remember who. It was a fictional show, not a news program, but some character was quoting this. So it's very memorable, and he's really trying to frighten people here. You're going to lose all the things that you love, that you have come to expect. The roof over your head,
Mhm.
and all the way to, the food that you eat, your family, your universities, even civilization itself, arts, letters, everything comes to a stop, and you go back into this very primitive state where all you got is just fear, and you won't be able to sleep, you'll constantly be on guard, and it's fear of violent death, just to in other words, it's the painful,
Mhm.
gruesome death that he is trying to scare people with.
Mhm.
People go into these battles thinking, I'm going to die in glory, right?
Mhm.
And if I die in glory, at least I'll be remembered, and yada yada. And he's saying, no, most likely you're going to die in obscurity, and it's going to be terrible. It's going to take a long time. A lot of warfare back then was truly awful, and people could lie out there for a day.
Mhm.
And if they were lucky enough to be brought back, there wasn't no medical care for the most part. So he's trying to remind people, this is like the worst possible thing that could happen to you.
Uh-huh.
You do not want this. It is not glorious. It's not, noble. All right, so, then there's another quite famous passage down the bottom of that page, which we've already talked about, but this is where he says, if you doubt this about other people and what will happen, just ask yourself, do you lock your door at night? Do you
Mhm.
lock your valuables up?
Mhm. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
So, yes, human nature is like this, and you've got proof of it in your own behavior. Okay. Now the question is, was there ever a state of nature? We've talked about the Civil War. That definitely was his example. He talks about the savages
Mhm.
as though they do, but maybe they don't actually live in a total state of nature. He also, I don't have it listed there, but in Leviathan he also talks about the relations of nations with one another.
Okay.
And he says this is similar but different. It's similar in that they're all sovereign and independent, and there's no overarching government that can control them. However, it's different because if an individual is attacked, he or she is most likely to die and cease to exist. But if a nation is attacked, there's a lot more hope that something of it will remain.
Okay.
And for that reason, there's a relative sense of security in international relations compared to individuals in a state of war.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Civil War is his main example, and no, it's not. There's no perfect example of exactly the scenario that he depicts in the state of nature, but that is what he had in mind. Mm-hmm.
So his quote unquote perfect, pretty much.
Yeah,
Mhm.
right. When it'd have to get pretty bad to get as bad as what he describes, but yep. All right, so we have in chapter 14 the beginning of the discussion of the natural laws.
Did he just talk this chapter was kind of confusing to me. Is that supposed to be normal? Because there were a few sentences that, well, it just seemed like he rambled for a while in certain points, and I was just like, They're just kind of going, a few parts are just going over my head.
Well, that's not unusual, and he does have a rambling.
Well, this one, I understood all the other chapters fine.
Mhm.
There's a few parts in here just like,
Well, it may be the sort of jarring, state of nature versus, what's this doing here, and he introduces it here because he ties the first and second natural laws up to the social contract. Most of the time when we think of natural laws, we don't think of the making of a social contract. We think about moral rules. And so that may have thrown you off a little bit. He actually incorporates making the social contract into the natural laws, and then he goes on to discuss what we would call moral rules.
Okay.
The first thing to establish is that he says in this natural condition, there is no just or unjust, no right or wrong, okay? He will discuss natural laws and moral rules, but he's clearly saying in the state of nature, we cannot apply them, okay? Because the survival imperative is so strong and it's reasonable, we can't expect people to stop and go, oh no, I'm not going to kill you because that's wrong and there's a natural law against it. So the natural laws are, you might say, suspended in the state of nature. People know them because he says they're rational rules, that we know that if everybody followed these rules, we'd have peace. But we can't follow them, okay? So that's one thing to keep in mind. When we get to the social contract, he'll say they still aren't binding. The sovereign has to decide how to interpret them and how to apply them, or whether they should be applied. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. What brings us into agreement is the fear from the state of nature. And out of that fear, we get this first natural right. He calls it a natural right, actually, in the text. That might be another confusion, because in the chapter title, he says natural laws. But then he talks about the rights of nature as well as the laws, right? But to distinguish, to be clear, the first right of nature is that you have a right to everything that you can take or that you can do to protect yourself. That's your first right, okay? And that's really the only right that we continue to have, okay? And no one can take that away. So that's the one inalienable right that human beings have. And even after the social contract, we have it. Okay? So, he'll talk about if you live in society, but the police aren't there, and you become under assault from robbers, you have the right to kill them.
Okay.
If you're in a state of civil war and the sovereign can't protect you any longer, you have a right to transfer your allegiance to the other side, because there's no one and doesn't it make sense? If your life is under threat, of course you're going to do whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So, got to leave it there, but that's a good place to start up next time. And we'll do chapter 15 or 14 and 15 and hopefully move on.
Yeah, do we need to have any part of, are we going to discuss any of